She said the words I didn't dare to admit, and suddenly, nothing between us felt accidental. Started with a glance, a moment so ordinary that, at first, he almost missed it. The cafe was busy that afternoon, the murmur of conversations blending with the hiss of the espresso machine and the soft indie music playing over the speakers. He had come for a quiet corner to catch up on some reading, headphones tucked around his neck, yet somehow his attention drifted. And then he saw her. She was in her early 40s, confident but not flashy, moving with a grace that only comes from years of experience. Her hair, dark with strands of silver catching the light, fell softly around her face, and when she laughed at something on her phone, it was like a warm melody that drew him in without permission. She wore a simple, elegant outfit, a tailored blouse and a flowing skirt, but it was the way she carried herself that made her magnetic. Every small gesture seemed deliberate, yet effortless. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the tilt of her head when reading the menu, the subtle shift in posture as she scanned the room. He tried to focus on his book, tried to tell himself it was just curiosity, but the pull was undeniable. His eyes kept drifting back to her, and he found himself noticing things he hadn't expected. The way her fingers lightly drummed on the table while she waited, the faint perfume lingering in the air as she moved, the warmth that seemed to radiate around her. There was something quietly commanding about her presence, something that made him feel simultaneously out of place and entirely seen. When their eyes finally met across the room, even for just a fleeting second, his heart skipped. There was no overt recognition, no dramatic spark, but in that instant, a subtle acknowledgement passed between them, like the world had contracted just enough for them to notice each other. He felt a mix of admiration and nervous excitement, the awareness of a magnetic force that was impossible to ignore, and yet, the faint hesitation of knowing the gulf in their worlds. She seemed older, wiser, more assured. He felt the weight of his own youth, his inexperience, and yet, strangely, he sensed that she might see beyond that. He returned to his seat, pretending to read, but his mind was anything but quiet. He studied her silently, noting the curve of her smile, the way she adjusted her scarf, the subtle grace in every motion. He realized he was not just curious about her appearance. He was drawn to the sense of self-possession she carried, the quiet confidence that made him aware of his own awkwardness in contrast. The cafe's atmosphere, the hum of conversation, the clink of cups, the soft warmth of sunlight spilling through the window, became a backdrop to a tension he couldn't name. It was a tension built not on words, but on the electricity of recognition, the delicate awareness that something unspoken had begun. And in that ordinary moment, he felt the first stirrings of a fascination that would not fade, a slow, simmering pull that promised that this brief encounter might become the beginning of something far more complicated, far more intimate, than he had ever anticipated. It wasn't long before their paths crossed more directly. He hadn't expected it, but life has a way of nudging moments forward when curiosity lingers too long. She was standing near the counter, her attention on the menu board, brow slightly furrowed in thought. He noticed it, the small human hesitation, and for reasons he couldn't explain, felt compelled to step closer. "Can I help?" he asked, voice casual, hoping it didn't sound too eager. She glanced up, those deep, observant eyes meeting his, and a hint of amusement flickered across her face. You're offering advice on coffee?" she asked, playful but not mocking, as though she were testing him, gauging the sincerity behind his gesture. He shrugged, half-smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm not a barista, but I have survived a few late-night caffeine crises," he said, gesturing to the menu. There it was, a small spark, the first real exchange beyond the fleeting glances. Her laugh came easily, like a gentle breeze brushing through the tension he had been carrying since their first sight. She tilted her head, studying him with a mix of curiosity and quiet amusement, and he felt, for the first time, the subtle pull of attraction as more than just admiration. This was recognition, acknowledgement of his presence in her world. He suggested a drink, trying to keep it casual, and noticed the way she leaned slightly forward as she considered it. Just a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, yet charged with a quiet energy he could feel in the space between them. Their hands brushed briefly when she took the menu from him, a fleeting touch that lingered in his mind long after. He could feel the warmth of her skin against his fingertips, soft but deliberate, and the brief contact sent a ripple of awareness through him. As they stepped aside to wait for their order, the space between them didn't feel accidental. It was a delicate dance of proximity, close enough that he could notice the faint scent of her perfume, warm and inviting, yet far enough to respect boundaries. Conversation flowed easily, light but layered, teasing and sincere in equal measure. She shared a small anecdote about her morning. He responded with honest curiosity, and in that rhythm, the first threads of connection were woven. He noticed the way she listened, truly listened, with her eyes tracking his movements, with a tilt of her head that made him feel seen in ways few ever did. And in turn, he found himself opening up, sharing thoughts he normally kept tucked away. The cafe noise faded around them. The music, the chatter, the clink of cups became a soft soundtrack to the intimacy forming quietly, almost imperceptibly, between them. By the time they received their drinks, the tension was no longer just a flutter in his chest. It had taken form. Not urgent, not overwhelming, but palpable. An unspoken acknowledgement of curiosity, desire, and the dangerous thrill of possibility. He knew, with an almost embarrassing certainty, that this encounter would not be the last. She was aware of him too, that much was clear in the way her gaze lingered a beat longer, the subtle, teasing smile that promised understanding without explanation. And just like that, a simple conversation over coffee became the first spark of something neither of them could name, but both felt in the quiet resonance of every shared glance and light, accidental touch. If you want, I can expand Keynote 3 next, diving into the first real emotional connection and subtle vulnerability, keeping the sensory and slow burn tension strong. Do you want me to do that now? You said, expand Keynote 3, 500 words. ChatGPT said, absolutely. Here's an expanded Keynote 3.4, she said. You want me. I see it. Around 500 words, keeping the slow burn, YouTube-ready, emotionally intimate style. Part 3 Emotional Depth / Small Confessions, expanded. After their first playful exchange, the connection between them quietly deepened. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was the kind of intimacy that seeps in unnoticed, a gentle layering of shared glances and thoughtful words. Later that week, by sheer coincidence or quiet fate, they found themselves walking together through a quiet park as the late afternoon sun cast long golden streaks across the paths. He felt unusually aware of her presence, the way she moved with ease, her posture relaxed yet deliberate, the subtle confidence that seemed to radiate from her without effort. There was a softness in her gaze now, less teasing and more curious, as though she was exploring not just who he was on the surface, but the quieter corners of his mind. He noticed how she tucked her hair behind her ear, how she adjusted her bag strap with a grace that seemed automatic yet somehow mesmerizing. The conversation began lightly, books, music, small observations about the city, but gradually it shifted, without pressure, into something more personal. She spoke of moments that had shaped her, little vulnerabilities she rarely revealed, and he found himself responding with honesty he usually reserved for close friends. He felt a warmth in the exchange, a subtle trust forming, as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them in that soft, sunlit space. At one point, he laughed at a memory he shared, and she reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing lightly against his forearm. The touch was brief, almost accidental but electric, sending a shiver of awareness that lingered far longer than the contact itself. He realized that the gestures between them had begun to speak louder than their words, conveying curiosity, understanding, and the faintest hint of something unspoken yet deeply felt. They stopped by a quiet bench, the hum of the city muted by the trees and the golden haze of sunlight. She leaned slightly closer as she spoke, and he found himself drawn into the space around her. Her voice softened, carrying warmth and a hint of wistfulness, and he noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she shifted when revealing something personal. He wanted to bridge the gap, to reach out, but he restrained himself, savoring the delicate balance of proximity and respect. As they parted later, the farewell was understated. A brush of hands, a shared smile, but it carried weight. His mind lingered on the small gestures, the way her presence had settled into him, leaving traces he could feel in his chest and the warmth in his palms. He realized that what had begun as simple fascination had quietly evolved into something more complex. An awareness of emotional depth, of a connection that promised both comfort and subtle tension. For the first time, he noticed the vulnerability beneath her confident exterior, the quiet layers that made her who she was. And for the first time, he wondered how it might feel to be trusted, not just admired. The awareness was intoxicating, and he carried it with him long after the park faded behind him. The start of an intimacy that would grow slowly, deliberately, with every shared word, every glance, every small, meaningful touch. By now, the quiet rhythm of their interactions had developed a magnetic tension that neither could ignore. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was in the small things. The lingering glances, the way their hands seemed to find each other even when accidental, the brief moments of proximity that left him acutely aware of her presence. On this particular evening, that tension became undeniable. They were walking home after an event, the city quiet around them. Streetlights cast pools of amber on the pavement, and the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain that had passed earlier in the day. He noticed the subtle sway in her step, the gentle cadence of her voice as she spoke about something mundane. Yet to him, every word carried an intimacy that felt carefully measured. She walked slightly ahead, but every now and then, she'd glance back, and those looks, fleeting, playful, yet intense, made his chest tighten. As they paused at a crosswalk, he felt the pull of proximity stronger than ever. The space between them felt both too large and impossibly small. His fingers itched to brush against hers, to close the distance just enough to test the invisible line between them. And then she did something that made his heart skip. A subtle step closer, the slight lean that brought her shoulder almost brushing his. It was casual, effortless, yet deliberate, and he felt the electricity of her presence in every nerve. Their conversation slowed, and for the first time, he noticed the depth in her eyes, the way they held questions, hints of amusement, and a quiet acknowledgement of what was unspoken. The silence between them was rich, charged with possibility. He wanted to speak, to admit something he wasn't ready to voice, but every instinct told him to wait, to savor the moment. The tension wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a layered awareness of desire, hesitation, and mutual recognition. Then it happened, a moment so small it could have been missed by anyone else. Their hands brushed as she adjusted her coat, fingers grazing lightly over his knuckles. It was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a ripple through him that left him acutely aware of her warmth. He realized that this subtle touch carried more than casual contact. It was an acknowledgement, a test, a silent conversation between two people who both sensed the magnetic pull growing between them. She smiled then, a quiet, knowing curve of her lips that made his stomach twist in ways he wasn't prepared for. And in that smile, he felt both the thrill of attraction and the weight of the age gap, the social awareness of how improbable their connection might seem to others, and yet, the undeniable truth of the desire simmering beneath the surface. As they continued walking, the city lights blurred into a soft, intimate glow, framing the moment perfectly. Every step felt deliberate, every glance loaded with meaning. He knew, with a clarity he couldn't deny, that the unspoken attraction between them had reached a peak, a tension so palpable that neither distance nor distraction could erase it. The world felt quieter, slower, wrapped around this unvoiced acknowledgement. They wanted each other, even if neither had yet dared to say it aloud. The moment came quietly, without fanfare, yet it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. They had ended up in a small, dimly lit corner of a quiet cafe, the soft glow of the overhead lights casting warm highlights across her features. He could feel the tension coiling in his chest, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness, as if the universe had finally allowed this private moment to exist. They talked, as they had many times before, about mundane things, books, the weather, small life updates, but beneath the surface, there was an unspoken current pulling them closer. Every word, every gesture, every subtle brush of her hand across the table felt loaded with significance. He noticed the way she leaned slightly forward, elbows resting lightly on the wood, and how the soft sway of her hair caught the lamplight in golden strands. His gaze was drawn to her constantly, even when she wasn't looking at him, and he realized with startling clarity just how deeply he had been paying attention to her. Then she spoke. Not casually, not teasingly. This time, her tone carried a gentle certainty. "You want me?" she said, her voice soft but deliberate, eyes locking with his in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. "I see it." The words hit him like a current of electricity. His chest tightened, and his breath caught in that peculiar way it does when a truth you've been denying is finally exposed. He wanted to respond, to protest, to explain away the thoughts he had tried to keep hidden. But the honesty in her eyes, the subtle curve of her smile, the warmth in her presence, everything told him that denial was pointless. Instead, he simply nodded, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table where hers had rested moments before. The touch was accidental, yet it was charged with meaning. For the first time, the barrier between them, the hesitation, the fear of misreading signals, the awareness of the age gap, seemed less important than the raw acknowledgement of desire. She shifted slightly closer, and he could feel the warmth of her presence more acutely than ever. There was a deliberate softness in the way she observed him, a patient kind of understanding that seemed to say, "It's okay to feel this, to want this, even if it feels complicated." Her confidence was no longer intimidating. It was inviting, a safe harbor in the storm of his racing thoughts. In that quiet, shared space they lingered, neither rushed, neither forced the moment. Yet the unspoken language between them had grown louder than words. He felt the weight of her gaze, the subtle tension of proximity, and the almost imperceptible shift of her body leaning toward his. He realized that desire alone wasn't the point. It was trust, the willingness to be seen, the courage to acknowledge what had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. As the evening drew on, they parted slowly, hands brushing lightly as they rose. But the confession had changed everything. The tension remained, yes, but it was now accompanied by a thrilling sense of possibility, a recognition that the bond between them was no longer silent, that the first step towards something deeper, something real, had finally been taken. After that confession, the rhythm between them shifted subtly but irrevocably. The playful tension had softened into something warmer, more grounded, a quiet intimacy that didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations to make itself felt. It was in the way she let him walk slightly closer than before, the way their shoulders brushed while navigating crowded streets, and the way he found himself instinctively adjusting his pace to match hers. They began spending more time together, often in unassuming spaces that allowed for comfort and closeness. A quiet park bench became their sanctuary, the soft rustle of leaves overhead forming a gentle soundtrack to conversations that stretched lazily into the evening. He noticed how her presence seemed to anchor him, how her laugh felt like sunlight spilling into his chest, warming corners he hadn't realized were cold. Touches became more natural, more intentional, but never forceful. She would lightly rest her hand on his arm while emphasizing a point, or casually brush her fingers against his as she reached for a cup of tea. He felt each touch linger a beat longer than it should, the warmth radiating from her skin settling into him in a way that was comforting and electrifying at once. Their proximity wasn't urgent. It was deliberate, a slow exploration of closeness that neither wanted to rush. One afternoon, they shared a quiet moment in her living room. Soft music played in the background, sunlight slanting across the wooden floor, and he found himself sitting closer than necessary on the couch. She leaned slightly toward him, a shoulder brushing his, and he felt the heat of her presence without words needing to be exchanged. The unspoken understanding between them was palpable. This space was theirs, a small world of trust and tentative desire. He began noticing the small gestures that revealed her comfort with him. The way she would tilt her head when listening, the subtle smile that touched her lips when he spoke candidly, and the occasional flicker of vulnerability in her eyes when she shared personal thoughts. He realized that intimacy wasn't just about desire. It was about being allowed into someone's inner world, even in small ways. Even mundane moments were charged with meaning. A shared cup of coffee, walking side by side through quiet streets, or brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Each act was a thread weaving them closer together. He felt a growing sense of security in her presence, a trust that allowed him to let go of the nervousness and simply be himself. By the end of these quiet, tender days, he understood that their connection had deepened beyond initial attraction. There was a balance now between desire and care, between subtle longing and genuine emotional closeness. The age gap, the societal expectations, even his initial hesitation, they all mattered less than the reality of how their presence affected each other. Every brush of a hand, every shared laugh, every lingering glance was a building block of trust, a silent affirmation that what was unfolding between them was real, meaningful, and uniquely theirs. By now, their connection had evolved into something that felt effortless yet profound. The tension that had once buzzed between them like an electric current had softened into a quiet, steady warmth, a trust and understanding that needed no words to validate it. They had spent weeks learning the contours of each other's presence, savoring the small moments that carried more meaning than grand gestures ever could. It was a late afternoon when the culmination of their slow-burn journey quietly revealed itself. They found themselves sitting together on a park bench, the golden sunlight filtering through the trees and casting soft shadows across the path. The world seemed to pause around them. The distant hum of the city, the occasional chirp of birds, the faint rustle of leaves, all fading into the background, leaving only the space they shared. She leaned slightly toward him, her shoulder brushing his ever so lightly, a touch that felt both familiar and thrilling. He could feel the warmth radiating from her, a quiet reassurance that everything unspoken between them was understood. Their hands found each other's almost instinctively, fingers intertwining in a gentle, deliberate hold that spoke of comfort, desire, and trust all at once. He looked into her eyes, noticing the subtle flicker of vulnerability and quiet joy there, the acknowledgement of everything they had navigated together, every hesitation, every laugh, every fleeting touch. And she looked at him with a gentle certainty, the kind that comes only from experience, from knowing oneself and recognizing the sincerity of another. It was in that gaze that he felt the culmination of their journey, the realization that this bond was real, meaningful, and worth nurturing. There was no rush, no dramatic declaration, just the steady presence of each other, and the intimate knowledge that their feelings were mutual and true. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her fingers lingering against his skin in a way that sent a quiet thrill through him. He felt the same, his hand rising to gently rest over hers, a silent affirmation of connection and care. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully relax, to let the intensity of longing transform into something warm, comforting, and enduring. The age gap that had once seemed daunting now felt irrelevant compared to the bond they had cultivated. It wasn't about who was older or younger. It was about the space they had created together, a space of honesty, trust, and subtle desire. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they shared a quiet laugh over something trivial, their faces illuminated by the soft glow. Their shoulders brushed, their hands stayed intertwined, and in that shared stillness, there was a profound sense of resolution. They didn't need grand gestures or declarations. The slow accumulation of touches, glances, and honest words had brought them to this moment of quiet affirmation. He realized, with a gentle awe, that this connection would stay with him forever, a tender reminder of what patience, attention, and vulnerability can create. And she, in turn, gave him a smile that was both playful and certain, a final silent acknowledgement that yes, they had found something rare and true in each other. In that moment, nothing was missing, nothing left unsaid. The slow burn had reached its full flame, and they sat together, content, secure, and infinitely aware of the quiet magic that existed between them. If this story made your heart race just a little, or reminded you of a quiet connection that lingered longer than words, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a moment that changed everything? Just like this? And click the bell so you never miss another story where love unfolds slowly, beautifully, and unexpectedly.